Here's the question I get every single day, and I want you to listen carefully because the answer is going to change how you think about your position entirely. If the Clarity Act is a foregone conclusion, if we already know it's passing, then why is XRP not already pricing it in? Think about that for a second. The regulatory war is over. The bill is moving. Both parties are aligned. And yet, the price is grinding sideways. It doesn't make sense on the surface. But what I'm about to show you is that the surface is not where the action is happening. The real repricing of XRP is not going to happen on the day the Clarity Bill passes. It's going to happen in the 90 days after, and most people are going to miss it completely. Welcome back. If you're new here, this channel is not about hype, hopium, or moonboy price targets. What we do here is read the structure underneath the market, the mechanics, the math, and the institutional behavior that tells you what's actually happening before it shows up in the price. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the Clarity Bill, specifically what happens after it passes, and what that means for XRP's repricing event. Let me start with a hard truth. The vast majority of people watching the Clarity Bill are staring at the wrong thing. They're watching for the green candle. They're watching for the day of announcement pump. They're refreshing price charts and waiting for the moment the gavel hits the desk and XRP goes parabolic in real time. And I want to be very clear about something. That is not how institutional repricing works. That is not how it has ever worked. Cast your mind back to the Ripple SEC case conclusion. Think about how long the XRP community had been saying, "This is the most important legal decision in crypto history." For years. For years, this community was beating the drum. And when the decision finally came down, when a federal judge officially ruled that XRP was not a security, do you remember what the price did? Almost nothing. Flat. People were furious. They couldn't understand it. But here's what was actually happening beneath the surface. The institutions who needed to act on that ruling, the firms managing billions of dollars, the custodians, the asset managers, the ETF architects, they didn't act on the day of the ruling. They went back to their risk committees. They went back to their boards. They spent 3 to 6 weeks getting sign-offs, legal opinions, and updated compliance frameworks. And then, about a quarter later, XRP went on one of the most aggressive parabolic runs we have ever seen, and the ETF applications started hitting all at once. That is your blueprint for the Clarity Bill. And here's why this is even bigger than the SEC ruling. The SEC ruling removed one legal risk. The Clarity Act removes the entire regulatory ambiguity structure for every institution in the United States at the same time. We're not talking about one judge's ruling in one case. We're talking about a federal legislative framework that gives every bank, every broker-dealer, every custodian, and every fintech in America a clear legal pathway to engage with digital assets publicly, openly, and aggressively. The first domino was the SEC case. The Clarity Act is the entire wall coming down. Now let's talk about the math, because the math here is what most of the market is completely ignoring. Here's what the Clarity Act actually unlocks from a numbers perspective. We know that there is currently an estimated $27 trillion sitting in Nostro and Vostro accounts globally. These are pre-funded liquidity accounts that banks are required to hold in foreign currencies in order to settle cross-border payments. That is $27 trillion in capital that is functionally locked, dead money sitting in accounts around the world doing nothing, just waiting to be used as a settlement buffer. XRP and the XRP ledger were designed specifically to eliminate the need for those accounts. On-demand liquidity means you no longer need to pre-fund. You convert, you transfer, you settle in 3 to 5 seconds, and you move on. You don't need to park $27 trillion around the world if you have a functional bridge asset that can handle real-time settlement. Now here's where the math gets interesting. The total circulating supply of XRP is roughly 57 billion tokens. If you want XRP to function as a real-time bridge asset against even a fraction of that $27 trillion in cross-border flows, let's say it needs to support $1 trillion in daily transaction velocity. The math on required token price starts to become very clear very fast. The higher the price of XRP per token, the fewer tokens are required to move the same value. That's not a Moonboy argument. That's a liquidity mechanics argument. Higher price equals higher utility efficiency. The asset has to be worth more to do the job it was designed to do. The Clarity Act is what opens the institutional floodgates to let that math start playing out in the real world. And here's the number that almost nobody is talking about. There are approximately 55 to 57 billion XRP tokens in circulation. Exchange reserves, according to recent CryptoQuant data, are sitting near multi-year lows. That means the liquid, available-to-buy supply is shrinking at the exact moment that institutional demand is structurally about to explode. This isn't a prediction. It is a supply and demand requirement. Now let me show you what the smart money is actually doing while retail is out here waiting for the green candle. Ripple has spent the last 10 years signing partnership agreements, running pilots, and building infrastructure with some of the largest financial institutions on the planet. BIS documentation, central bank pilots, Tier 1 bank testing, this is not speculation from the XRP community. This is documented. But here is the critical thing that most people fundamentally misunderstand. A significant number of those partnerships have NDA clauses. And the reason those NDA clauses exist isn't because the partnership is secret. It's because publicly disclosing that you are using a digital asset with unresolved regulatory status exposes your company to material risk. You are essentially disclosing an unquantified liability to your shareholders and your regulators. No general counsel at a serious financial institution is going to let that announcement go out the door without regulatory cover. The Clarity Act is that cover. Think about what happens the moment that bill is signed. Those NDA restrictions don't just expire, they become irrelevant. And not only do they become irrelevant, announcing the partnership becomes a competitive advantage. In a world where AI, instant settlement, and agentic finance are dominating the boardroom conversation, you want your shareholders to know that you are building on the leading regulated digital asset infrastructure. You want that press release. You want that announcement. Brad Garlinghouse has stated publicly that Ripple's pipeline of institutional relationships is deeper than what the market sees. David Schwartz has consistently pointed to the real-world utility layer being built beneath the public noise. These are not people who speak carelessly. What I'm telling you is that the Clarity Act is the regulatory unlock that converts a decade of silent institutional relationship building into a very loud, very public, very market-moving announcement cycle. And based on what we saw after the SEC ruling, where the quarter after the ruling was when the real price movement came, I expect the 60 to 90 days following the Clarity Act signing to be when we start seeing these partnerships come to light, one after another. That is what reprices XRP, not the bill itself, the announcements that follow it. So when does this happen? Let's lay out what the timeline actually looks like. The Clarity Act is currently in motion. Based on the latest information from people close to the legislative process, passage is no longer an if, it's a when. The primary variable is whether it gets signed before or after midterms. There is legitimate political friction here. No party wants to hand the other a major legislative win on the doorstep of an election. That is real. That is not FUD. But here's the thing. Even if it slides past midterms, we are talking about a matter of months, not years, not another endless cycle of waiting. Months. And the moment it passes, the clock starts on what I'm calling the announcement window. Based on the historical pattern of the SEC ruling, I would mark Q2 and Q3 of this year as the highest probability window for the first wave of public institutional partnership announcements tied to Ripple and the XRP ledger. That is the date you should be marking on your calendar, not the day the bill passes, the day after the board meetings conclude, the day after the legal teams give the green light, the day after the PR departments finalize the announcements that have been sitting in draft for months, waiting for this exact moment. The fuse has been lit. The Clarity Act is not the explosion. It is the permission structure for the explosion. Here's the brutal question you need to ask yourself right now. When those institutional announcements start hitting, when Bank of America or a Tier 1 Japanese bank or a major European custodian comes out publicly and says they are using the XRP ledger for settlement, where do you want to be? Because here's the reality of what happens in that moment. The retail crowd, the people who have been calling this community delusional for years, the people who said blockchain adoption was a nothing burger, they are going to want in, and they are going to be buying from whoever is willing to sell. Exchange reserves are already near multi-year lows. CryptoQuant on-chain data shows that the liquid supply available for purchase is structurally thinning. The window to accumulate at pre-announcement prices is, by definition, closing. Institutions don't move after the announcement. They move before it. That is the entire point. The smart money doesn't buy the headline. They sell it to you. The question is, when those headlines start dropping, are you on the right side of that trade? Are you one of the informed? Or are you still waiting to see what happens? The structure doesn't wait for comfort. It rewards those who pay attention when the room is still quiet. Here's where we are. The Clarity Act is no longer a question of if. The institutional partnerships are real, documented, and waiting for regulatory cover. The supply math is undeniable, and the historical blueprint from the SEC ruling tells us exactly how this repricing happens and when. This is not the day the gavel hits. This is the 90 days that follow it. If this kind of structural, data-grounded analysis is what you've been looking for, subscribe. And drop the word clarity in the comments below if you made it this far. I want to see who is actually paying attention. In a market full of noise, we trade on structure. Stay patient, stay rational, and as always, we don't wait for the future. We plan for it.